Hey everybody, it's Dr. Quinn here, and I thought I would start this video with passengers. Of course, this is one of the readings that you had from last week that you tackled in the packbacks that we did and that we should have tackled last night for class, and my apologies for that. But I thought I'd give you a visual sense of this text. I found a version of it online, so we do have a PDF of this. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what was going on at the time, some historical context to passengers, and some thoughts about character development in this story especially, and perhaps the rationale or the argument, the theme behind this text. You'll notice here that this was written, I think in 1969-ish, and it won the Hugo Award for Best Short Story 1970. It's one of those texts that's perhaps about aliens, but perhaps it's not. There's been a lot of discussion, and if you look in the book and you go into the bio that's at the beginning of the book, that there's a discussion about perhaps that this text is representative of the times that it was presented in. And if you think, 1970, that's right in the middle of significant sort of upkick in drug use in the United States. If you think of how drugs were introduced, certainly before the Vietnam War, but it's an era of more discussion, more open use of drugs, especially marijuana and acid, and LSD, right? Mushrooms, drugs to allow people to hallucinate, to lose control of their senses. These are things that were going on that was quite famous in the public consciousness. And of course, Silverberg uses this idea of one's body being taken over, and how does that affect two characters? We've got Helen and we've got Charles, right? So we could understand this text in one of two ways. We could take a direct reading and say there are actual aliens that are only mean ill toward humans. Humans are playthings toward the aliens, and that the humans are describing the sort of despair that they have, and that they have no absolute control of their lives. So that's one reading. And if you read it that way, it's perfectly fine. That is one way to interpret passengers, for sure. You can see the despair and concern is not as strong in Charles as it is in Helen. There's some very interesting character development. What we know about Charles is that he's in his 30s. He worries that even when he's possessed, he worries that the aliens didn't take good care of him, and was he a good lover? Did they do his sit-ups? He's sort of vapid in the sense that, or perhaps you didn't see that. You saw that this is somebody who's adapted to their circumstances quite well. That what else can you do but try to think about yourself and keeping yourself healthy in a way, and perhaps maybe he compartmentalizes the experience. And you can kind of see that in the description of how he goes about his life. And he's like, oh, well, I was ridden for 3 days. I'm just going to take the rest of the day off. So he's using that to his advantage. Helen, on the other hand, is extremely upset and vulnerable through her being ridden, and feels like that she can't make connections. And so you can go through the text and you can kind of see that. That's one reading of this. The other reading of this is that the aliens are taking the place of what happens when people become addicted to drugs, right? When they use drugs, and think about just the overuse or overabundance of alcohol use, and what happens when people black out, that they don't remember what happened to them and they weren't in control of themselves. And yet often through addiction, people will continue to use that drug and have those experiences that are often quite negative in nature, but because of the addictive properties, they can't really control themselves. So a lot of this is about what happens to us when our bodies are outside of our control. And you can use that as a lens from which to look at the text. All right, so if you go to page 431 in your text, we're looking at early on in the reading. You'll notice that Charles is sort of speaking to himself. And this starts off very, we have that estrangement, right? Because there are only fragments of me left now. Chunks of memory have broken free and drifted away like calved glaciers. By the way, what a beautiful opening simile, right? So there's a lot of the sort of poetic language in this by Silverberg. You can see he's a real ideas person, not so much like literary ideas and development of character. And what happens is very psychological sci-fi. This would even fit into our upcoming week 7 readings for sure. We could say it's aliens, but it's not really. It's more likely an explanation of the human psyche, right? But there's also a bit of Bradbury in this, with some of the ways that things are described with the simile that I've got highlighted here. He said, we can never be sure of all the things that our borrowed bodies did. We have only lingering traces, like imprints. Okay. You'll notice in here as well that with that estrangement, it's going to make some readers off kilter just a little bit. That's what sci-fi does in this sort of speculative space of a imagined future where perhaps there are aliens. If you're doing the direct reading of this, that you're not going to know the whole story, but it's the mystery that causes readers to jump forward, to keep moving in the text. So it certainly fits here. And you can see, has my passenger been eating dung with my mouth? They do that. They do anything. There's real horror in that last sentence. They do anything, because Silverberg is not going to tell us everything that they do. What Silverberg is leaning on is for the reader's imagination to sort of fill in those particular blanks. One of the other things you can do is, remember, if you look a little bit further, this is supposed to be 1987. Right here, it says it very early. Since this was written in like 69, this is perhaps, almost 20 years in the future. The technology is going to be an imagined late 1980s from a late 1960s perspective. So you can see how the future is imagined, and it's not all that different, with the exception of the house robot, right? That can dispense medication and that can make you breakfast and things like that. So we have those little elements of what the future could look like. It almost feels like a very sort of Jetsons future, or the future if you ever gone to Epcot and done some of the rides in the front of the park. Right. So we also see a very interesting sort of play and mix of dialogue and content. And so I think that we don't see as many texts that are so dialogue forward. I think Asimov's Reason was certainly one of them. And I think A Martian Odyssey was another, but we're going to see a lot more of that in the weeks to come. One of the things you can do as a science fiction reader in reading Silverberg's text is put yourself in the position of the characters here. Everybody is sort of operating in the best way that they know how, not always in the same way, but there have been social rules that have sort of evolved around being ridden. No matter what's happening to a person, you do not involve yourself, whether they're being attacked or attacking somebody else on the street, as we see later in the story, and you have to sort of imagine for yourself. This was written in the late 1960s. Think of the civil rights era and what was happening with a lot of people who were protesting the different civil rights rules and actions, and how so many other people stood back and did not involve themselves. And so there's a lot of what we'd call text as artifact. And if you go into the assignment overviews for essay one of the texts you can look at is text as artifact, and you can pull out specific data points in this text, and you can say, oh, this is really representative of the 1960s, of Silverberg's era. Yes, he's suggesting that this is a text that imagines the 1980s, but we still have the focus on drug use, we have the focus on actions and not getting involved. There's also elements a little bit later on toward the end of the story where Charles is reconnected to his passenger, and he steps away from Helen. Helen has been overcome by his arguments. He's embarrassed and made Helen uncomfortable. He's not a great person in the story. He's perhaps the protagonist, but he's a bit of an antagonist for Helen, certainly, because he uses her discomfort to tell her how great she was in bed and how they belong together. But Helen is just trying to make a connection. So if that part made you feel uncomfortable, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. He's not a perfect character. He's not Dick Jarvis from A Martian Odyssey. He's a human being with significant flaws, and one that perhaps we're not meant to feel particularly comfortable with. But there's this scene in the end of this where you have to wonder, has he been ridden the entire time, and that the passenger's letting him in because he finds Helen. He remembers part of their time together. He entices her to spend more time with him. And right when he's gotten her on the hook and she's willing to get into somebody caring about her and having feelings and seeing her for who she is as a person, he turns and goes and hits on a man in a bar. right? So the passenger, we know that he's not gay, right? But the passenger, at least from the way that he talks about being a lover, right? He does not have any sort of gay sort of sentiments earlier in the story. Or perhaps he's bisexual, but that was certainly something that was not mentioned. And if you think about what was going on in the 1960s and 1970s with LGBTQ rights, you can kind of see at the end how the bartender, they don't act like they're being ridden. They're not acting herky-jerky. But Charles and the other gentleman in the bar at the very end, the bartender gives them a look and acts a certain way with them as if, oh, that's just not an appropriate action, right? The bartender serving the drink scowls, but says nothing. Again, a predominant behavior of the time. And if you go back and you do a little bit of cultural research as what was going on, and we look at Stonewall riots, for example. I just wanted to bring this up very briefly. This is just the History Channel's little discussion of the Stonewall riots. The History Channel is not my favorite channel, or not my favorite website for historical data, but for this blurb, I think it's fine. This happened in 1969, right in the news, right as Silverberg was writing Passengers. This happened in New York City. The New York City police raided the Stonewall Inn. It was a gay club in Greenwich Village. The raid sparked a riot among bar patrons and neighborhood residents because the police were hauling employees and people out of the bar. There were days of protest and violent clashes, and this really sparked the gay rights movement. So you can kind of understand in the story that there is and of course in 2024, it's not that gay rights is universally accepted. As a matter of fact, you can probably see on the news where a Canadian family moved to Russia because they wanted to be separated from gay people, and now they're having a very hard time in Russia. That's just been on the news this week, and so there's still a lot of disdain toward the gay community, but we can see how it seeps itself into little bits of this text. And so there's so much representative in a story about a lack of consent, about perhaps this is aliens, perhaps this is drugs, about looking at character development and the shape of the story. There's so much that I think we could sink our teeth into if we were to talk about this much further than the 12 minutes that I'm just spitballing here in this video. But the final thing I want to have you think about is, if you do a secondary reading, determine for yourself, is the passenger still controlling Charles? And if that's the case, what does that mean for humanity as a whole? It would change our entire society. Would you ever get on a plane, for example, knowing that the pilot could be taken over by a passenger at any moment? What would society be like? What would it be like for your partner to disappear, for your partner to bring somebody into your home and act out in a really sort of sexually explicit way in front of you? And based on the moral code of the time, you cannot react or to see your children be affected in this way. Silverberg's making an argument that humanity will continue on. That's perhaps the biggest aspect of this. But what else could they do, or would you be able to do? So this is sort of a thought project on, what do we do when we're overtaken by drugs? Or what do we do with an extremely sexually explicit society? And here's the funny thing. The free love movement was happening in the 60s. And so perhaps this is about the free love movement, not drugs at all. Would you be surprised to know that Silverberg also wrote a lot of like softcore text and young adult text? He was an extremely prolific writer, and he wrote in multiple genres. He wrote sex stories. He wrote sci-fi stories, and he wrote young adult stories as well. And so maybe you just decide a story is just a story. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if you dig into this and you look into the library databases and see any of sort of the published content on this. But I hope that some of the content that I'm bringing up on different ways to read this is a text of consent. There is no consent if you do not have all of your faculties, either through alcohol addiction, through drug addiction, through sexual addiction, or through aliens taking you on as a passenger. I hope this has been informative for you. And if you have any questions, I'm going to embed this as a studio video, meaning you can, as you're listening to this, you can leave comments right along where in this audio if you have any sort of thoughts or ideas. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.